Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 21st and tonight's movie is Dr. Sleep. This is kind of a big one. There's a lot of things going on at once with this movie. To begin with, it's directed by Mike Flanagan, who is, at this point in time, my favorite horror movie director. I believe I've seen 5 of his movies, all for Horror Nights, and I thought all of them were great. This is based on the Stephen King novel of the same name that is a sequel to The Shining, which I haven't read that many Stephen King books, but out of the ones I have, the original Shining novel was my favorite. But you can tell just from the trailer that this is also specifically a sequel to the 1980 Shining movie by Stanley Kubrick, one of the most iconic horror movies ever made. One thing to note is that the movie The Shining did take a lot of creative liberties from the book, to the point where it almost just feels more like a standalone thing. But since this is based on a Stephen King book that was written as a sequel to the original novel, while also being a sequel to the movie, Mike Flanagan apparently took it upon himself to represent both the highly visual and artistic style of Kubrick with a much more character or dialogue-driven style of Stephen King. The movie follows little Danny Torrance, who is now Dan Torrance, all grown up, and he is investigating this cult that takes advantage of kids that have that shining, that psychic power. He's also trying to help out a little girl who has the same psychic powers as he does and is being targeted by that cult. So obviously he's going to see this as an opportunity to be the parental figure in a time of crisis for this little girl that his dad wasn't to him. Adult Dan Torrance is played by Ewan McGregor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the main villain, Rose the Hat, is played by Rebecca Ferguson. I obviously know Ewan McGregor. The only thing I know Rebecca Ferguson from is the way that she iconically didn't sing Never Enough from The Greatest Showman. This is no shade to her, I'm just making fun. I really don't watch many movies. Most of the movies I see are during October. This is also the longest movie of Horror Nights, very fitting for a Stephen King adaptation. I'm not a fan of Stephen King in general, but I really did like the original novel, The Shining, and I really like Mike Flanagan's work, so fingers crossed, I'm hopeful for this one. I'm gonna go give it a watch. You know what's really crazy? I almost wasn't going to watch this movie this year. I wanted to watch a Mike Flanagan movie, but I saw how long this movie was and realized it was an adaptation of a Stephen King book I haven't even read, and I originally planned on watching Ouija Origin of Evil, but instead decided to switch over to this one. And what I got is an adaptation that aims for so much, it tries at so many things, and it succeeds at all of them. In the past, I have kind of thought about the fact that there never really was a very faithful adaptation of The Shining made by, like, a filmmaker. The original Shining from 1980 is not a super direct adaptation, and the miniseries of The Shining that Stephen King himself made in the late 90s was way too direct an adaptation of the novel. It was like 3.5 hours long. But this movie, in addition to adapting the story of Dr. Sleep, in the third act also seems to seek to bridge the gap between Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick's idea of The Shining. And the fact that this movie succeeded at that, it gave me something I legitimately did not think was ever going to happen. I feel like it has earned a 10 out of 10 rating. This has cemented Mike Flanagan as my favorite horror movie director even harder. I knew he was good at adaptation when I saw his movie version of Gerald's Game, but this is like something else entirely. This goes beyond even that. Needless to say, this is my favorite movie of this year's Horror Nights so far, and also, just based on sheer effectiveness, is my favorite Mike Flanagan movie. And although Dr. Sleep isn't as spectacular if you remove it from that context, the context of bridging the gap between novel and movie the way that neither Stephen King nor Stanley Kubrick could in the past, also on its own is just a really good movie. It's a really good continuation of Danny Torrance's character, because obviously he would have been traumatized by the events at the Overlook Hotel. And this movie is just as much about him dealing with that part of himself as much as it is him protecting this young girl from this weird cult. When you look at the acting, Ewan McGregor did very good as Dan Torrance, as he goes by as an adult. However, I will say this, I am so used to seeing him with a beard like the Obi-Wan Kenobi that him without it just looks wrong to me. Like, Ewan McGregor, clean-shaven, has more cognitive dissonance to me than Ewan McGregor with American accent. The villain, Rose the Hat, who I'm pretty sure is at least partially based on the sleep paralysis demon Hat Man, is done pretty well. And lastly, you have Abra, who is the young girl that Danny is protecting in this movie. I thought that she was great too. And I really did appreciate that they just sort of skipped the part where they have to like grudgingly join forces and like learn to like each other. It's implied that they were sort of like psychic pen pals for years before they even met in person. So that sort of allows them to just kind of hit the ground running and get to the good stuff. Abra's character in particular was so interesting because I kind of got the impression that she was like one of those children characters that feel like they're written by someone who has never been around a child or been a child before, just like these weird mini adults. But not only was that intentional, it served a purpose. Aside from the fact that Abra isn't a normal kid, she has incredible psychic powers and also seems to be extremely intelligent. She also has this self-reliance about her that is bred out of not wanting other people to think that she's weird or judge her or worry about her. It was actually kind of impressive just how subtle her characterization and character development throughout this movie was. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have Dan's character, whose character development was a lot less subtle, but was also incredibly satisfying. Dr. Sleep is no slouch when it comes to horror, but what makes this movie so good is the characters. However, what makes this movie truly exceptional, what makes it a 10 out of 10 in my opinion, is mostly due to its final act, which I'm not going to really talk about until we get to the spoiler section of the review. And I really want to talk about that, so I'm just going to end the first part of the review now by saying if you like the original Shining movie, if you like the Shining novel, if you like Mike Flanagan, any of those are good enough reasons to check out Dr. Sleep. It was not only so much better than I was expecting, it was much better than I even thought was possible, to be honest. And with that, I want to go into spoilers. The main conflict of Dr. Sleep concerns the cult or group, I guess, called the Knot, which are basically vampires, but instead of sucking the blood of mortals, they suck out the life force of humans that have psychic energy. They call it steam. Danny calls it shine, but it's the same idea. And once the Knot is made aware of Abra, who is even more powerful in her psychic abilities than Dan was at his peak, and they made it a point that Danny's psychic abilities were uncommonly powerful, they see her as like the ultimate catch. The original plan is to use Abra as bait to bring the Knot into like this secluded area. It was like a park, and then just shoot them all. And that actually worked a lot better than I was expecting it to work. I mean, one of the good guys does die in the process, but so do almost all the bad guys. The second in command does actually manage to briefly kidnap Abra, but she and Dan work together to deal with him, and by the end of it, the only one left is Rose the Hat. And Dan is worried that even with him and Abra working together, they might not be able to stop her, so he decides to bring this to the place where it all began, the Overlook Hotel. One of the big plot points in The Shining, especially the book, was the fact that the building could like feed off the psychic energy that Danny was putting out. The reason why the Overlook Hotel targeted Jack specifically was because he was an easy target. They were just using him because they wanted to get Danny. And in the novel, there's a lot more of a character study into Jack, the relationship he has with his family, his alcoholism. In the Kubrick movie, The Shining, there's not that much of that characterization with Jack. It was a lot more interested in just being a psychological horror first and foremost. But then going back to the Overlook Hotel allows them to explore some of that characterization, this time with Dan. Because he responded to the traumatic situation with the Overlook using a lot of the same vices that Jack did. He became an alcoholic. He fell into self-destructive tendencies. And there's this really, really good scene. It might be the best scene in the movie, where after just walking around the set and seeing all these familiar locations from the Kubrick film, I mean, I personally don't love the Kubrick movie. I do think it's really scary. I do think it's really well made, but I don't think it's a great adaptation of the book. Anyway, seeing these sets, seeing these sites again in this new context was really cool. But then he goes to that giant party room where Jack had that conversation with the bartender in the original movie, and he has a conversation with the bartender, except it's Jack. And in this movie, they opted to just use actors that look like the original actors from the 1980s Shining and like recreating parts of that, which I guess is fine. That's probably the most respectful way they could have done it. But anyway, a big part of Jack's fall in The Shining is him literally losing himself to the hotel. In the original movie, it ended with him becoming a part of just a picture of the staff. And you see all these years later, he doesn't even have an identity anymore. He doesn't remember himself as Jack Torrance. He's just another one of the ghosts in the Overlook. And it was so fascinating seeing this conversation between Dan Torrance and Jack Torrance, who is quite literally a ghost of his former self. But then we kind of have to put a pause on the geeky stuff and continue with the plot of the movie that we had been watching for the last 2 hours. And we have the final confrontation with Rose the Hat. And while it's not easy, they are able to overpower her and defeat her using the ghost of the Overlook. But that's not where it ends. If it had stopped there, this would have been a really good movie, but it's what happens next that's special. Dan gets taken over by the ghosts of the hotel, and he starts chasing Abra around with an axe in a direct mirror of what happened in the original movie. And one of the things that was kind of lost in adaptation, or I guess Kubrick wasn't really interested in adapting, is the sort of tragedy of Jack's character. He tries to fight against his own self-destructive tendencies, and he ultimately does fail. However, in Dr. Sleep, we get to see that sort of redemption that Jack never got through Dan. The moment that actually made my jaw drop is when they reveal that what they were doing was like a twofold plan. The first was to destroy Rose the Hat, and there was also the plan to put the ghost of the Overlook Hotel to rest once and for all. You see, this whole thing of them trying to settle this at the Overlook Hotel, even like the ruined, abandoned Overlook Hotel, quite literally could not have happened if they had directly adapted the book Dr. Sleep. Because in the original Shining, the entire building is blown up in a boiler explosion. That's how it ends. One of Jack's primary jobs as a caretaker was to watch the boiler pressure and dump it when it gets too high. And Danny is literally able to make the possessed Jack, who basically is just the Overlook Hotel, drop everything that it was doing and run to the boiler room when he reminds him that Jack didn't dump the boiler pressure this morning. And there's that same sort of reveal here, but this time it's not due to carelessness or thoughtlessness. That was something that Dan did on purpose. And just like in the original Shining, the hotel goes down to the boiler room to dump the pressure, but this time, unlike Jack, Dan is able to fight back and stop himself. And with the things that he's learned over the years, he is able to truly succeed where Jack failed. Dan does die at the end of Dr. Sleep. He dies in, I don't think it was a boiler explosion, it was more like a fire caused by a gas leak. But just like how he was able to communicate with the ghost of one of his mentors, Dick Halloran from the Overlook, Abra is also able to communicate with Dan's spirit. And you see that both of them have developed over the course of their journey. Like, at the beginning, when he first meets Abra, Dan is trying to encourage her to suppress her shine, to keep her head down and try to avoid being noticed because it was that, like, power within him that caused so much trouble in his youth. But by the end of the movie, he's telling her to embrace that power and use it for good, because she's a good person and she wants to help people. And at the same time, Abra also learns to be a lot more open with like what she's going through with her parents. About halfway through her movie, her dad got killed by the knot, and at the end of the film, she's able to like reassure her mother that no, Dad's doing okay, he's with Uncle Dan, we don't really end. And the mom is reassured by that because she knows her daughter is not just saying that, she actually knows that. You know that one god-awful thing that Hollywood's been doing lately? Well, they'll make a sequel decades after this really popular, beloved movie that just kind of feels like a soulless cash grab. And it also has, like, none of the things that made the original good. Dr. Sleep is, like, the antithesis of that. Aside from being an adaptation of Dr. Sleep, it's also sort of like a passion project by someone who clearly has appreciation for the original novel and the movie by Kubrick. And it has an ending that manages to do right by both of those things. I'd imagine that a lot of other people aren't going to be as appreciative of this aspect of Dr. Sleep as I would. But as someone who liked the original Shining movie, but also liked the novel more and wished that there was a better film adaptation of it, this delivered on that in a way I didn't know was possible. That aspect of it is what really makes Dr. Sleep special to me and what made me want to give it a 10 out of 10. And I think that is a good way to close this review. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you tomorrow.